It is my pleasure to unveil an innovation in burial services. The investors looked uncomfortable as they sat in the hot sun on the edge of John's latest investment. When the tech mogul had bought 500 acres of swampland, people had speculated that he meant to build another factory for his microchips. Tech magazines had floated the idea of everything from warehouses to a new robotics division and everything in between, but none of them could have guessed his true intentions. His stock price had doubled since the announcement, and investors seemed to be holding their breath to see what would come out of Yomite Solutions this season. Only his accountant had known the real story, and he had been sworn to secrecy. Not a word to anyone, John said, winking as his usual smile spread across his face. Wayne had snorted. "John, no one would believe me if I told them." Now here they were, their eyebrows raised as he talked about not some new piece of tech, but an innovation in the burial of all things. Behind me stands 500 acres of new growth, trees ready to provide mankind with oxygen, and many helpful species of insects and wildlife will find a place to live here. Beneath them, however, are the first in a long line of subjects in our land renewal innovation. The bodies are infused with seeds. The seeds take root and use them for nourishment, and as such, become a sort of casket for the dead. He saw some of the squirming looks held by those gathered and decided to squash them. Behind me stands what will one day be a new forest, a forest that will be untouchable thanks to the laws now in place. Think of it, every cemetery a forest, every boneyard a park, every place of death a place of rebirth. This is the future, a future that bodes well for the earth and for the health of our planet. Welcome to Yomite Pines Memorial Forest, a place of eternal rest and peace. The investors clapped. It wasn't over-enthusiastic, but they clapped. They would see, in time, that it was a good middle ground. John had done a lot of harm to this planet with his factories, his smog, and his landfills full of obsolete electronics. If he could turn people's minds and grow a memorial forest in every state, it would go a long way towards making him feel better about the business and his soul. John Yomite, in fact, hoped to be buried in one of these forests himself one day. He had no way of knowing how soon that dream might become a reality. That was the first night that he had the dream. He was running through the rows of newly planted pines, the ground groaning as they grew towards the heavens. They towered over him, their branches grasping for the sky, and as they blotted out the moon, he heard their whispers. "Join us, join us, join us in the soil." The ground sucked at his feet as he ran. The sand clung to him as if trying to hold him down, and as he jogged through the park that he had created, a cold wind blew amongst the trees. He woke up in his bed as the whispers grew, and breathed a sigh of relief when he realized it had all been a dream. Did the water in his morning shower look a little darker as it went down the drain? Were there leaves in the pocket of his sleeping shorts? Was there maybe even some mud he overlooked on his arms and legs? Maybe, but if there were, John didn't see them. He shook it off his nerves as he got ready for the day, but it wouldn't be the last time he ran through the trees by night. "Wow, John, if you'd told me this thing would take off like this a year ago, I would have called you crazy." John looked down over the forest of pines and oaks, their tops coming in as they grew strong. The glass window over his tower made the perfect observation platform, and the glass was thick enough to block out the whispers he sometimes heard when he walked the grounds. Wayne was going over the numbers, but John was barely listening. "You did call me crazy," John said, looking down over his forest of trees. He had built this tower so he could watch the forest grow, and he found he was truly at peace when he stood up here. Watching them sway, watching them grow, it was all so different from anything he had done before. "Did I?" Wayne said. "I guess I was wrong. This has been a bigger windfall than any of your previous endeavors." John would have agreed if it hadn't been for the incidences that kept cropping up. Who would have thought that people would pay so much to save the planet and to be one with the burgeoning forest? John asked. "Now, if we could just figure out why people keep going missing, we'd be set," Wayne retorted. He said it with a laugh, but John really didn't find it funny. If it had been one or two, John could have understood, but what kind of memorial garden loses double-digit guests in their first year? The large forest had become a popular tourist spot, and people had come to camp and walk and take in the natural beauty of the new-growth forest. The trees were only about half the size that they would grow to be, but they were still an impressive stature. They were the living embodiment of those who had nourished them. At least that's what the papers and some of the journals were saying. There were plans to grow more of them if participation was good, and so far it had been. People were interested in helping the environment, and having a quiet and beautiful place for their relatives to visit them. And the list of people who had bought places in Yomite Pines would facilitate the buying of another 20 or 30 acres at least. It had all been looking so promising before people started going missing. At first, it wasn't anything to get excited about. A couple of campers never arrived back home. An older couple that never returned to their car after a visit. A man who never walked back out the front gate after walking in. These things were odd, but not unexplainable. People did all kinds of silly things, and this was no more than someone who simply decided to leave by another way, or had forgotten to check out, or perhaps decided to lose themselves on purpose and find a quiet place to die. The kid, however, was something else. Marcus Lorraine was 6 and had accompanied his parents into the little forest so he could visit his grandmother. They had walked amongst the trees, taken in the paths and little bridges and the shallow river that ran through it, but when they had turned to go, Miss Lorraine had noticed that her son was nowhere to be found. She swore he had been with them when they crossed the little bridge over the river. She swore he had been with them when they stopped to dip their toes into the water. She swore he had been with them when they stopped at the bathrooms. She also swore that she couldn't be certain after they had passed the picnic area and started heading back to their car. "I don't remember much after the picnic area, if I'm being honest," she said, her dreamy voice at odds with her tearful demeanor of a moment before. "I'd been walking along, listening to something, and for a moment it was almost like I was hearing my mom talk to me. I know how that sounds, but I'm telling you that I could almost hear her voice." Her husband had said something similar, though not quite the same. He could swear he heard people whispering just out of sight, like they were sitting in the woods and discussing important matters. He described it like the scene in The Hobbit, where the dwarves keep interrupting the elves' party. He could hear them, but he knew that if he went to investigate, they would all just melt away and reappear somewhere else. Regardless, neither of them could say when little Marcus had left their side, but he was gone now, and they wanted him found. John stayed with the parents while the forest was searched. He had set up a little command center near the visitor center and was directing volunteers from there. Mr. Lorraine had gone out to help them at the start, but by sunset, he was back at the tent and sitting with his wife. The two were holding each other, both praying quietly as they waited for their son to return. They were upset, but John had yet to see them cry. They were afraid, but they didn't look overly fearful. He would have thought they'd be in shock, except that they kept looking into the forest as if someone were calling to them before going back to their prayers. "This isn't good," John said under his breath. "You don't say," Wayne had said, looking at the parents as he pitched his voice low. "Be as glib as you want, but Marcus Lorraine's disappearance doesn't look good." Wayne pulled him aside out of earshot of the grieving parents so that they could talk. "Do you have any idea how many kids go missing in the national park every year? Do you know how many theme parks lose kids without the help of creeps? Kids wander off, John. Probably find him asleep under a tree somewhere." They did not find him asleep under a tree somewhere. They didn't find him at all, as it happened. Marcus was the 15th person to go missing in the park that year, but he wasn't the last. "We've had hundreds more pre-orders for the upcoming acreage. We'll sell the plots as quickly as they become available. It's almost like we're printing money." John was glad that Wayne had forgotten about the kid so easily, but John found it a little more difficult. He remembered each of the names, each a civil suit their families tried to file before his lawyers shut them down, and he supposed he probably always would. Wayne went on talking, but John couldn't take his eyes off the trees. Their sway was so hypnotic. Maybe this was why people kept going missing. That, or the whispering that he heard sometimes. He could even hear it a little up here, but it was always worse when he was on the grounds. It was like a slithering little voice that wormed its way into his ears, begging him to come and join the others who had already come to this place. And why not, he thought. They all seemed to have found peace here. Everyone seemed to find peace here. Maybe that was why so many of them came here too. "How's your mom?" Wayne asked suddenly, and the question jarred him back to reality. "Some days better, some days worse. She's fading, but she's going out slowly." "Will you plant her here too when the time comes?" Wayne asked, the question sounding uneasy. "I've saved her a spot from the very start," John said, looking at a place near the base of the tower. "I grew this forest for her, after all." Wayne excused himself after a little more small talk, but John stood there and watched the trees sway. Who wouldn't want to be laid to rest in such a peaceful place? It's an honor to stand here and ring in a year since the opening of Yomite Pines Memorial Forest. The crowd applauded excitedly, but as John stood looking out over them, all he could hear was the wind through the trees beyond them. They were all pines here at Yomite Pines, somehow or another. Mighty pines that grew lush and deep green in the hardy soil. In about a year, they had grown past the projections put forth at the start, and John now stood beneath towering trees that had been little more than half-grown saplings 2 years ago when he'd begun planting. He shuddered a little as something else rustled against his subconscious, but he put it aside, like he always did. It was just nerves, after all, just like the dreams. I'm proud to say we've incorporated another 100 acres, 50 of which has been donated by the North American Wildlife Foundation to help with the deforestation efforts. Of those new 100 acres, we have already filled 50 of them with fresh growth and new remains. The Yomite Pines Memorial Forest will soon be a forest stretching across the newly reclaimed land, and our world will be better for it. The applause from the crowd was much more enthusiastic than they had been last time. The thought of a forest of dead people had been a little sickening, a little spooky too, but now they were behind him. This reforestation project was a big hit, and people were signing up for plots in the hundreds. Though Yomite Pines might be a big hit with the people, John was beginning to have reservations about the project. It had been 6 months since Marcus had disappeared, and now his mother and father were also missing. John had once liked to stroll out here, just taking it all in and soaking in the peaceful landscape he had created. He had been on one such walk about 2 weeks after Marcus had gone missing, when he had seen Mrs. Lorraine walking down the path towards him. Walking might have been a stretch. Shelley Lorraine was wobbling like a drunk, and as she came towards him, she looked as if she were barely in the world. He called out to her, asking how she was doing and if there was any news on Marcus, but it took 3 such calls for her to look up and acknowledge him. "Huh?" she finally said, shaking her head as if she'd been sleepwalking. "Oh, Mr. Yomite, She seemed to mumble through what she was before answering. "As well as I can be, I suppose." "Did you come to look for Marcus?" he asked, wondering why she was here if she was still looking for her son. The whole park had been searched from border to border, but no sign of the kid had been found. It was as if the ground had simply swallowed him up and left nothing behind. They had moved on to the surrounding scrublands, but John was certain that he had seen the mother in the park more than once. The father had come in once as well, but that was the last time that John had seen him. He hadn't come back out again after that, and John supposed he was doing better than his wife. Here she was, high or drunk or both, and John would have to tell security to keep an eye on her. "Yes," she said, looking off into the trees as if someone had called her. "Yes, it's like I can hear him when I'm here. He keeps calling for me, and I keep hoping I'll find him. Excuse me," she said, and stepped into the tree line as she went off into the towering gravestones that surrounded them. That was the last time that John had seen her. The last time that anyone had seen her, actually. The whole family had disappeared, and Scott, the security guy over the park, actually showed him the security footage of Mr. Lorraine coming in but never leaving. He asked John what he wanted to do with it, and John had told him not to tell anybody about it. He must have left in a crowd, and we missed him. There's no reason to tell anyone about this. It was a tragedy, after all, but as guilty as John felt, he couldn't have something like this sabotaged by one family. This was his chance to make amends for some of the things he had done, to make amends to the one person whose opinion mattered to him. That was the last anyone spoke of the Lorraines, but it wasn't the last John thought of them. "The new acreage will be open to the public next year, once the new growth has had time to get its roots. Until then, I invite all of you to enjoy Yomite Park in its fullest." They applauded again, disappearing as John waved his way off stage. Wayne was waiting for him off stage too, all smiles. Maybe it was because he was an accountant, but as long as the money flowed, Wayne was happy. "Great speech," he said, walking beside John as the two made their way towards the tower. John watched as many of the people seated there took up walking through the park, looking in awe at the trees that had been grown from human compost. "We shouldn't be letting people just walk around the park anymore," John said suddenly. "It's too dangerous." Wayne looked confused, but as John finished, he grinned like a shot fox. "How else do you intend to pay for park services and expansion?" he said, smiling woodenly. Maybe it shouldn't be expanded. It shouldn't be open to the public either. No one picnics in a graveyard. No one goes birdwatching at the cemetery. The longer we let them walk the paths of Yomite pines, the more of them will go missing. We're up to 20 this year, and it's probably more like twice that number. Something's happening here. You're too money hungry to see it, John said, now real emotion in his voice. Wayne looked like he wanted to say something cutting, but he contented himself with a lame, says the billionaire tech mogul. John rounded on him. This has nothing to do with money, nothing to do with fame or glory either. I've spent years killing this planet with my selfish ventures, and now it's time to give back. The planet deserves a chance to heal, and I intend to give it that. Yomite Pines will sweep as far as I can push it, an untouchable beauty that will heal the world. But there's no reason that people should be free to wander here. The door to his car was open, and he climbed in as he gave Wayne one final withering look. I want to close the grounds by the start of next month. I don't care what it costs. Make it happen. Wayne watched him go, and he sighed as he watched him get smaller in the rearview mirror. John felt more at ease as he drove off. The incessant whispering was finally cut off, and that was good because it was getting to be more than he could take. Every time he came out to the pines, it got worse, but John still found himself drawn to the place. John dreamed about it most every night, and sometimes he woke up with dirty feet or muddy shoes at the foot of his bed. John didn't live too far from the park, but it was still 5 miles or more. Was he walking there in the middle of the night? Surely he wasn't driving, but what other option could there be? In his dreams, he walked amongst the trees, hearing the voices on the wind. In his dreams, he saw people walking amongst those trees, people who were as thin as fruit skins. They wanted him to join them, to come and be a part of them, and John found it harder and harder to ignore their call the longer it went on. He knew that one day he'd have to go to them, but until then, he still had work to do. This was a gift to his mother, after all, the woman who had been so disappointed with his actions, but had never stopped loving him. This was a final gift to her before she left the world forever. This was the last thing that he could do to make amends. The valet parked his car as he pulled up to the hospital, and as he rode the elevator up to the 7th floor, he wondered what state he would find her in today. She'd been getting weaker as the cancer ate at her, and it seemed unfair that it should be something like that would take his mother from the world. She, who had marched against deforestation, who had gone to sit-ins for cleaner oceans and for endangered species, the woman who had loved the earth with all that she had, was going to be taken from it by something as mundane as cancer. His mother was going to be eaten alive by something that none of his money could do anything about, and John hated that more than anything. He came in to find her napping, but she opened her eyes as he took her hand and smiled at him. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" he asked, trying not to cry, but knowing that his eyes were leaking. "Like I'm dying," she said, smiling despite herself. "Just not fast enough for the cancer's liking. We added another 100 acres to the park today. The ceremony was great. I wish you could have been there." "Me too," she said, her eyes drooping. She was so tired these days, so easily tapped out. "Mom, am I doing the right thing here? I know this is helping the environment, helping the world, but is it the right thing?" His mother smiled, her face sad but content. "I can't tell you that, dear. We all have to decide what's right and wrong for ourselves. I only want to do what would make you proud of me, what would make you proud to have me as a son." John was crying, really having a good boo-hoo, but he didn't care who saw it as he pressed his face against her shoulder. "Well," she said, laughing hoarsely, "then I'm glad my pain could be useful for something." He just sat there with her, the two of them enjoying the other's company. John had saved her a place for after she was gone, a place where she could be at peace within the earth. Her final good deed for the planet she loved so much. She would grow within the heart of the park, likely the largest tree in the park when she was done. She would rise above all the others, dwarfing all the pines as she rose for the sky. Till then, however, he would mourn her, one day at a time. He was running, the soil mashing between his toes as he went. The trees rose up around him, their voices high and beautiful. They called to him as he ran, asking why he was fleeing from them. They could bring him peace, too. They could make him complete within the soil. The moon was a ghostly sickle over top of him, and as he ran over the muddy ground of the park, his park, he felt more and more lost. He had built this place, had designed the layout, and it was unthinkable that he should be unable to find his way. This was a dream anyway, he told himself. He was dreaming all this, no matter how much dirt he found on his sheets in the morning. These were all just nightmares, regardless of the filth he found at the bottom of his feet. Nothing here could hurt him, nothing could really get him, but that did little to hamper his fear as he ran. "Come to us, John. Come find peace in the soil." His spine prickled. Had that been Miss Lorraine? He took turns at random, his feet feeling heavy the further he went into the park as it sucked at him. The ground was hungry, and now it wanted him to go along with the others it had taken. He didn't understand how it could still be hungry, but it ate greedily as he sank more and more of them into the soil. Now it wanted him too, and as his feet came onto the sidewalk, he breathed a sigh of relief. The ground couldn't get him on the sidewalk. At least he didn't think so. He seemed to come back to himself as that thought came to him, and he realized this may not be a dream. Suddenly he was standing on the sidewalk, wearing his comfortable sleep pants and his sleeveless t-shirt, staring at the whispering sea of trees. He had found himself here before, wondering how he had gotten here, and as he reached for his phone, he realized it wasn't in his pocket. It wouldn't be, would it? It'd be on his nightstand, right where he'd left it. He looked at the tower and was thankful that he'd paid for night security. He started walking towards the edifice, preparing to answer some questions yet again. This is starting to become a problem, John. Wayne was pacing around his office in the tower as John sat drinking coffee in his night clothes. Scott had called Wayne for some reason, and John would have to have a word with him about that later. John signed the paychecks around here, not his accountant and VP of sales. Scott was likely worried that John was having a break from reality. John realized that didn't change matters, though. This was still John's project, and he was in charge. If the shareholders find out about this is going to be bad. John laughed. Shareholders? What shareholders? This project is being bankrolled by me and me alone. Wayne shook his head. I'm not talking about the park, John. I'm talking about the shareholders in your other companies. If they find out that you're wandering around your memorial garden every night, they might worry that you're losing it. John shrugged. Let them think what they want. This is more important than anything else. Wayne looked at him then like he might be crazy. Talk like that's gonna bankrupt you. I know you're torn up about your mother, John, but this isn't the time to give up. John didn't say anything for a little while, staring at the coffee as it sloshed in his cup. I don't know if I want to add more acreage to this place. I don't know if I want people here or not. The only thing I do know is that this work is important to the planet, if not the people, and it needs to continue. Wayne left not long after that, and John was left to stare into his cup and wonder. Despite what he had told Wayne, he added another 100 acres to the park. Despite what he had told Wayne, the people still came to the park. They had a man-made lake now, 3 picnic areas, and enough parking for everyone buried here and then some. They also added nearly 30 missing patrons to the tally, putting them at around 60. There had been many searches of the grounds, but no one had ever been found. It had become quite a mystery, and as John drove into the park, he grimaced at the graffiti on the welcome sign. People kept spray painting "Whispering" over Yomite on the sign, and John had replaced it several times already. He'd have to get Scott to check the cameras again, though he found the name extremely appropriate. John's dreams had far from abated, and he rolled his window up as the whispering tried to find its way to him again. They beseeched him to come to them, to join them, and John didn't know how long he could resist them. The dreams were drawing him out here nightly, and he'd started waking up in the park more often than not. It was becoming more and more apparent that he was simply walking here at night, and there didn't seem to be any way to stop that from happening. Lately, however, the calls had been in a voice that he couldn't refuse. He walked into the park, sliding in his AirPods as he came through the gate, and the whispering intensified. It really was a beautiful place. The pines had come in nicely, and they were growing tall and healthy. They stretched out from the gate now, a mighty forest that had risen from nothing, and he was proud of his work. He was haunted by that work too, but it didn't stop him from being proud of it. He had accomplished much in the 2 years since starting, but there was still so much work left to do. He stopped by one of the trees, the one near the base of the tower, and looked down at the new growth already poking its way through the soil. "Hey, Mom. Looking good," he whispered. She had passed about 3 months ago, not long after his conversation in her hospital room. She had been laid to rest in the park, his last gift to her, and the placard he had put up in front of her tree was the only real allocation for grave markers. Everyone else had a small number so their loved ones could find them, but his mother would only be important to him, and he knew that. She had been his last family, the only surviving piece, and now it was down to him to mourn her. When she had joined his dreams, adding her voice to the chorus, he didn't know how much longer he'd be able to hold out. Wayne was waiting for him when he got to the top of the tower, holding up the plans for the latest expansion. "We just got approval for another 100 acres. We should have it filled before June, and then the next 100 before this time next year, I guess. How much would it take to get another 1,000 acres? Wayne's eyes went a little wild. I mean, some of it would be available through government grants, but the cost would be steep. Make it happen. I don't care what it costs. Wayne looked at him oddly. You feeling okay? You're not planning on doing anything drastic, are you? He seemed to have noticed how close John was standing to the window. John couldn't exactly blame him for his concern. John had been feeling a little hinky, as his mom had been wont to say, and he wasn't sure what to do about it, or what he might do about it. I'll get the papers drawn up, Wayne said, rolling up the survey charts. I talked with Scott about the sign, too. As usual, they can't find anything on the cameras to blame it on. Just kids out for a little helling, I guess. John nodded, but it's pretty clear that Wayne couldn't hear the whispers. He didn't get it. Probably never would. He was the perfect one to run something like this, though he would never understand the importance of it, or the horror. The nights John had spent out here had shown him where the missing people were going, had shown him his own fate as well. The whispering would get him one of these nights. It was only a matter of time. John was tired, but the terror made his legs move as the mud sucked at his every step. Maybe tonight was the night. Maybe this would be the night they got him. Maybe this was the night he became a part of Whispering Pines. Even the name had slunk into his consciousness. It was fitting, too fitting, and he could no more outrun it than he could the ground that sucked at his feet. Suddenly the ground did a little more than pull, and John was up to his thighs in the hungry muck. Beneath the soil he could feel the strong grip of searching vines and realized that if he didn't start fighting now, the jig would be up. He yanked and tugged, his strong runner's legs feeling ineffective in the muck. He was losing ground, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and when the paved path came into view, he waited like a drowning man. The roots gripped at him, dragging him back, but John pulled onward, working for the shore. Suddenly, the dirt was up to his hips, and he was wading through the fresh mud. He wasn't going to make it, he thought. The roots would get him, the ground would take him, and he'd be with the dead. One of his nails tore up painfully as he grasped the sidewalk, but he pulled himself up nonetheless. He limped a little as he walked towards the tower, one of his ankles having twisted a little as the root grabbed at him. John's steps weren't just heavy because of the ankle, though. John hadn't gotten a good night's sleep since he opened this damn place. He was exhausted, living off cat naps in his office, or the 4 or 5 hours he snatched a night. John was used to weird sleep schedules, and he had kept strange hours throughout college, but as he got older, it became harder to maintain. He didn't know how much longer he could last like this, and as he came to a familiar placard, he stopped in front of it. His mother's tree was larger than it had any right to be. Seemed larger than it had been this morning, in fact, and the concrete bit at his knees as he dropped down before it. "Mom," he said, tears running down his face. "Mom, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I'm so tired. I want to rest. I want to..." When his mother's voice shuddered against him, like the caress of a bird's wing, he looked up and saw her. She was lovely, bedecked in leaves and green, the queen of summer in all her glory. When she reached down to touch his face, her hands felt like flowers against his skin. He closed his eyes as he leaned into her touch, her words like summer sun on his skin. "You've done your best, John. Come, rest with us." John nodded, pitching forward as the earth swallowed him up. He should have been terrified, but the embrace felt almost womb-like. It felt so natural, like coming home, and John breathed in a lungful of soil as the darkness enveloped him. "Welcome home," his mother said, and John felt at home. It's my tremendous pleasure to announce the expansion of Whispering Pines Memorial Forest. The park has become less of a memorial and more of a forest in its own right now, and I hope someday to see hundreds of forests like it, instead of useless granite slabs that do nothing but take up space. I know if my friend, John Yomite, or his mother, Terry Yomite, could see how this project had expanded, they would be very proud of the work we've achieved here. I've watched this garden grow into a mighty forest, and I couldn't be more proud to be a part of it. John watched as Wayne spoke to the crowd, telling them about the new backer who was interested in what they were doing here. John understood the words he said, things like the woman's name, Titania Thurston, the Green Society, and Kashmir Botanical Gardens, but they didn't mean anything to him. If someone was interested in his idea, that was good. If they let the forest rot, he supposed that was okay too. John was part of the Whispering Pines woods now, and he supposed that others would be too, very soon. Being a tree was probably the best thing he'd ever experienced, and he was eager to share it with others. Wayne still couldn't hear him, but he would, someday. Some of those in the crowd could clearly hear him, and they'd likely join him too, someday. John had time after all. He certainly wasn't going anywhere. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Saikat, Lee Kendall, Janet, and Chris Kinsella for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And, of course, thanks to Xaronan, Winter, Tyler Parker, Stephanie Carrington, Sarah ASMR, Hi Stacy, Emily Coltsfoot, and Cinnamon Fox, and Bella Lee for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. As I said, if you'd like to have your name read out at the end of every episode that I make, and maybe get a little more, come on down to Patreon and sign up, or become a member on YouTube. Ghostly Reader tier contributors get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and give it a look. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.